This is Scott Becker with the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast. Today's discussion is around three questions provided to me about private equity. And so the three questions are, does private equity affect product integrity? Second, is long-term client support sacrificed for revenue growth? And three, what are the pros and more importantly, the cons for founders after taking in private equity? So I'll try and address these three questions. And of course, the real answer to all of these is it depends. The biggest downside to private equity is it relies on a relatively heavily leveraged model. And so this can have impacts on all three of these questions. Generally, in a very well-managed private equity-sponsored company, it shouldn't affect product integrity. It shouldn't impact client support, but it will have impacts on the founder, pros and cons, and we'll talk about that. First, if a company is not over-leveraged, the company should continue to pursue greatness as a company, regardless of their private equity investor and debt load, particularly if the founder and the leadership is still very engaged, and particularly if it's not been over-leveraged and has become too fragile. The flip side to that is when a company becomes too fragile and too over-leveraged and debt payments start being too much as a percentage of the income being generated, it leads to all the problems that we're talking about. Product integrity can go in the wrong direction. Long-term client support could be sacrificed because at the end of the day, there's not enough margin left to take care of everything. Like there's an old adage in not-for-profit healthcare, no margin, no mission. And it's doubly true in private equity sort of financed businesses. If you're in a lower margin business and you add on a ton of debt, sooner or later, some of these other things are going to suffer. It could be product integrity, it could be client support. It just depends largely on how much debt and how big the margins are and whether it could support continuing to do greatness by clients and by products, or if ultimately the amount of debt has made it harder and harder to do that. The third point, and one of the question is the pros and cons for founders after taking on healthcare PE or taking on private equity. And again, this is all over the board. The biggest pro is it allows the founder to take some of the risk off the table. So many people that have built companies have all of their net worth tied up in that company, and at some point they need to de-risk. That to me is often the biggest pro. The other pro is sometimes you have great investors that can help you transition leadership and build the next level of the company, grow to a different level that you couldn't do when you were holding all that risk yourself. Now, the biggest downsides are you no longer own whatever you owned in it. If they add on a ton of leverage, it can be more fragile going forward because it has more debt and leverage on it, particularly if margins soften some. And third is, you no longer control which direction it goes. So if they decide they want to go one direction, you want to go a different direction, you often no longer have that control depending on the deal that you've struck with the private equity fund. In any event, we appreciate these three great questions that came into us around private equity. We hope you enjoy our responses to them. I know other people might think differently, but feel free at any time to send questions to Scott Becker at 773-766-5322. Thank you for listening to the Becker Private Equity and Business Podcast.